Hi, everyone. I just want to open this interview, I suppose, with Phil by making sure that whoever's listening understands that this interview is going to contain a fair amount of difficult themes and subjects. OCD, of course, but through the conversation about OCD, we talk about a lot of other things, bullying and shame and sexuality and the various components of Phil's life that he's learned to negotiate on his path towards sort of mental and emotional well-being and de-shaming. I think it's really important to have those conversations, even if they are difficult, because it helps us to find out that there's nothing shameful about who we are. That's a big part of why I'm really glad that I could have this conversation with Phil and that he agreed to come on the show. So without further ado, here is the interview with Phil. Thank you.
Well, I guess my dad grew up listening to punk. Both my mum and dad grew up in the 70s, and my mum gravitated towards disco and my dad gravitated towards punk. So he has a bit more of a snobbish attitude, I'd say, when it comes to punk. Like anything post 80s, it's not really punk or the rest of it.
Right.
But
yeah.
This band has been around for a very long time, and you had fans in the audience who were, my dad's age. And yeah, just the most amazing looking people. Saw a proper mosh pit for the first time since I was about 14.
Yeah. How close were you?
I stood quite far back. My friends did sort of say to me, "It's like, do you mind if I go in? I just go for your life, mate." So he was having a great time, but I just sort of stood back,
smashing around.
Yeah, my face is my money maker, so I couldn't really afford. One thing that was quite nice about that is that there seemed to be an etiquette about mosh pitting, which I never really expected. So there was almost like a protective barrier where it's almost sort of expected, like, okay, beyond this barrier, people are not involved in the mosh. So if people got too close, they'd gently be sort of guided back in. And people fell over, which I saw several times. People in the mosh would help them get up, and it didn't matter if you knew them or not. And it was really, really lovely. Really, really, really nice time. Not my kind of music, but it was just really interesting to just stand back and observe.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Because there is often a stigma around mosh pits and metal and heavy kind of music like that it's like aggressive people are doing it. Whereas the people I know who have fallen over in a mosh and gotten just picked up and helped by perfect strangers that were really kind and really gentle, they've all communicated that kind of feeling that there's a lot of gentleness. It's just kind of this expression of the more aggressive, more sort of chaotic side of these people,
Of course, and I think these people present as being very intimidating for someone who's not necessarily a part of that, like physically intimidating potentially.
Yeah.
But I think there's a distinction between being rightfully pissed off and wanting to express it and being violent or aggressive, and it was quite clear to me. They just seemed to be really lovely people. It was a really good time.
Cool, awesome. Shall we get started then with our subject? Sure. So I'm not entirely sure how to title it. I've actually got a sort of few different ideas, but because of our sort of theme conversation when we decided on this was to sort of look at the combination of OCD. In some ways, it seemed to me to be OCD, sexuality, and religion, and how they sort of combine to create a very powerful experience. At least they did for you. And another part of me, sort of that kind of collection resonates with the word shame for me, So a part of me was sort of like, is this a podcast episode about becoming comfortable with shame and kind of how it's come out as OCD and its various particular aspects, which we'll get into with you. This isn't the first question. This is just me thinking out loud about the title. But I think because OCD was the real focus, I'll start with that. So my first question was, what are the features of OCD for you? Like, how would you describe OCD to a layman or to someone that doesn't experience it?
Sure. So OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. It's normally, I'm really trying hard not to go on the medical diagnostic here. I'm not a medical professional, and
Yeah.
by all means, if anybody's listening and they hear this and they go, "Oh, well, I might have OCD," fair enough. I think there is some validity to be found in self-diagnosis, but I'd always encourage people to, go to a psychiatrist or a medical doctor to see their diagnosis. But it's essentially, I would categorize it as an anxiety disorder.
Right.
There's normally a rigidity just about people who have it, where it's essentially the typical understanding of OCD is that it's obsessions which are spurred by fear, generate fear in and of themselves, and in order for the person to relieve themselves of the anxiety that's generated from these particular obsessions, they need to engage in behaviours to nullify that, that pain. These obsessions can be really, really broad. So anything from like quite typical ones might be cleanliness. So this would be sort of the fear base for that would be contamination and getting sick. Other ones might be things being in order and not wanting clutter. But obviously to an extreme degree. I think that's something that I want to make very clear
Yeah.
in my contribution to this, is that I think every single human being has obsessive compulsive traits, because we are, we're too intelligent for our own good, and as a result of that intelligence and self-awareness comes quirks to the personality. OCD is not, checking the taps before you go out to make sure that they're not running, or making sure the door is locked 3 times before you leave the house. That's not what OCD is. It is incredibly debilitating.
Yeah.
For me, I guess the reason why I didn't necessarily pick up on it earlier was that my OCD, whilst the obsessions were definitely prevalent and that was very much there, the compulsions were more like rumination, psychological stuff, as opposed to actions that I was doing. So for me, my presentation of OCD, I came to find out, wasn't actually that abnormal and wasn't really atypical. I had no frame of reference for it because and this sort of goes into the whole thing about stereotypes around mental health and well-being. My idea of OCD was based on, I suppose, stereotypes that we all are aware of. But my OCD was predominantly obsessions about various things, and normally, most of the time, mental sort of compulsions to sort of rid myself of that fear.
Yeah, I noticed that my camera's stopped working, and I know that that's probably quite distracting. Is it okay if we continue for a bit before trying to find a fix for that? Because I don't want to drop what you're saying here.
No,
or should we
that's fine.
pause?
I'm not distracted. I mean, as you can probably tell, I tend to
flowing with it.
I tend to find eye contact quite difficult with people that I don't know very well. So I'm not even necessarily always going to be looking at you.
Okay.
And please don't say that's me being rude. That's just
no, not at all.
Just...
Not at all. Not at all. Okay. Yeah. So what you're saying is like there's a kind of scale here, the scale difference between what might be anxieties that you then sort of want to check, like checking the door, and the kind of degree of intensity that OCD would cause of that fear, of that anxiety, and then how that would turn into habitual compulsions and habitual obsessions that would become then what would be diagnostically maybe OCD. And in your case, you did suffer from that more powerful fear based structure of the mind that OCD sort of represents in diagnostic terms. Are you okay with talking about your experience of that, like in a little bit more detail? What maybe caused it? What ended up being the predominant sort of anxieties, these sorts of things?
Sure, I'm happy to talk about that. I say that with some hesitation because I think even though people who have OCD, they aren't mad, they aren't crazy. OCD, the thought processes and how it works, because we like to think of ourselves as rational beings. for somebody who doesn't have OCD, they can come across as crazy, and OCD can certainly make you feel like you're going crazy.
Yeah.
So there's an element of anxiety about that, but this is a podcast called Becoming Comfortable. So for, for as long as I can remember, I always I was a very fearful child from as long as I can remember. I suppose my first sort of obsession started with death anxiety. I became, I was raised in the Catholic Church, which will, I think will become more important later. But I was sort of grew up or was sort of raised with this belief that there would be an eternal life, that death wouldn't be something that I would need to consider. But when you're a kid, your concept of death is quite abstract. You don't really have much connection to it. But I remember around the age of 5, I really started to obsess about this. I never fully embraced the concept of life after death. So for me, that almost felt like there was a loophole through which death was a very real possibility. I would think about that a lot as a kid. But at that stage, it wasn't debilitating, because the thing is about OCD in terms of how it presents itself. You asked me where it comes from. I don't have a clear answer to that. Some people argue that it's genetic, and I think for reasons that I'll go into later, there is definitely a genetic component to my OCD. Some people argue that you're born with it, and it's the whole classic nature versus nurture argument. But one thing that is typical of people who go through OCD, and was certainly typical for me, was true to me, was that it manifests a lot later. Normally during puberty, so from the ages of like 10 onwards. I remember as a kid, I always had a morbid, a fascination for things that are a bit morbid. So, for example, my parents decided to show me Jaws when I was 5 years old, which in hindsight potentially wasn't the best parenting decision on their part. But I was always fascinated by morbid topics. I'd always watch horror films, I'd read stuff, and I didn't think much of it. I just thought, well, this is an interest that I had. And my late mum, God bless her, she used to read a lot of like gossip magazines that have a lot of sensationalist headlines. And she'd occasionally pick up the Daily Mail, which I found to be really strange, considering she was quite a socialist. But anyway, you sound like a bit of a snob. There would always be this sensationalized headlines. Like, you probably see it, like every year they will rotate about notorious killers in this country. I remember reading an article about the 2 boys who killed Jamie Bolger, and in all of these articles there's always like this armchair psychology and trying to oversimplify and trying to understand why people, but especially children, how they are capable of doing these horrible things. And one of the narratives that sort of went through the media was the idea of the fact that they watched horror films and that somehow had an influence on their violent behavior. I, as a kid who maybe read too much into things anyway, because I was highly anxious, although I didn't realize it at the time, but also didn't quite have that fully developed brain to recognize that it was bollocks. I made the connection of, okay, if I viewing this material, and if I'm interested in things that are a bit morbid at such a young age, that automatically I made the connection that meant that I was a threat, an actual physical threat to the people around me, that I would grow up to become a killer, basically. And I remember I started to get intrusive thoughts around that time, where I was getting intrusive thoughts of stabbing my family to death while they were sleeping. And in order to combat that, I would tell myself all the reasons why I wouldn't do that. You know, I love my family. I'd be lost without them. I think killing is wrong. I go through this sort of like Rolodex of reasons why not in my head.
Yeah.
And that maybe reassure me for like, I don't know, 30 seconds. And then like that loophole that I was telling you about where, you know, with your, you know, life after death thing, you know, that doubt, it might have even been a doubt of, oh, but I got into an argument, you know, oh, I do get pissed off with my mum and my dad sometimes. And then I would then go straight back on that fucking wheel of, oh, you must have a reason. Then it would go on and on and on. And I would never really find relief for what I was thinking. But it would normally, the thought that the cycle would break normally because I was so exhausted that I would just crash from the physical and emotional exhaustion of having that in my head and managing that. So that was the first sort of fear that I had, and that was there for a long time. I remember when I was about 13 or 14, between the ages of 11 and, you know, 16, which is obviously when I went to secondary school, and I'd walk to the bus stop on my own, or rather I'd walk home from the bus stop on my own. These intrusive thoughts would be there about hurting people that I would just walk past. These weren't people I knew, these were strangers. And I it sounds so ridiculous now when I'm pretty far from it, but I would time how long it would take me to walk home from the bus stop to my house, which I worked out to be roughly 3.5 minutes. So I would deliberately pick a song on my iPod that I had at the time that was around that length, and if I got home either before or after that song ended, I convinced myself that I'd hurt someone and potentially hurt them very badly. And my way of dealing with that and combating that fear was that I would look in the local newspapers to see if there were any assaults or murders or rapes in the area, which wasn't particularly helped. When I remember I was about 14, there was a report in the Brentwood Gazette about a girl from a local school who was sexually assaulted when she was cutting through the graveyard, which actually ran behind my house. And even though the timings weren't there, I wouldn't have been there. There was still that niggling bit of doubt in the back of my mind that I had done that. It's like the whole thing, oh, the chances, and you know, the chances are very low, but they're never zero, sort of thing. That's how OCD kind of goes with. And then another fear that I had, I remember when I was 11 years old, and this was around the time that I had sort of started to figure out that I, you know, might be gay. I wasn't sure at the time, because, you know, I was a kid, but I'm not saying that kids aren't aware at that age, but for me, it didn't necessarily feel like a concrete part of who I was at that point. And I remember, so I was still at primary school at the time, and I remember my sister walking me home from school, my older sister. And I said to her, you know, if I'm gay, does that mean that I'm going to grow up to become a paedophile? Now, that was just, it sounds mad saying it out loud now, but that connection between those two things seemed completely natural to me. It seemed like the very logical conclusion to come to at that time, that if I'm gay, that must mean that I am in some way a deviant, which could then extend to, okay, what's the worst possible deviancy that you can think of? Oh, somebody who abuses children. And that sort of went away for a little while, but then when I started to go through puberty and I began to, you know, develop sexually, and I began to have, you know, sexual thoughts and feelings and all that, it sort of came back in full force. And I became convinced that I would grow up to become a paedophile. I convinced myself that because essentially I started having intrusive thoughts about sexually abusing children. And again, I'd go through all the reasons why not. It's morally wrong.
Yeah.
Children should be protected. I'm not sexually attracted to children, all the rest of this stuff.
Yeah.
But one of the things that can happen with OCD, which can perpetuate the cycle, particularly the OCD, which I have some categories of, which I didn't know was a thing until I actually started looking up on the internet. Something called paedophile OCD.
Yeah.
It's actually a distinct subsection of obsessive compulsive disorder.
Yeah.
Where the person is convinced, like I was, that I would grow up to that I was a paedophile, or that I would become one.
Yeah.
And the thing is, with the brain, there is a phenomena called arousal non-concordance, where
Yes.
basically the thought of something sexual or sexual images can generate a non-sexual groinal response. And that can be anywhere from a tingling sensation in your groin to potentially movement, and in some extreme cases, although I never experienced this, erections.
Yeah.
Or wetness in women.
Yeah.
And when sometimes these intrusive thoughts would be accompanied with that groinal response, which I saw at the time as evidence of attraction.
Yeah.
So I would then force myself to imagine conjure up the most horrific images of child abuse that I could in my head, to sort of monitor how my genitals were responding, essentially.
Yeah.
And the unhelpful thing about anxiety-based groinal response in OCD is that by focusing on the subject of the obsession, it generates anxiety, and the anxiety can involuntarily generate more groinal responses, more tingling sensations.
Right.
So I would do the same thing, where I would just imagine it again. I would get a groinal response. I do it again and again and again.
Yeah.
And then it just, again, it only really stopped when I was so exhausted that I just couldn't do anymore.
Yeah.
I couldn't do it anymore.
Yeah.
And that is a fear that has sort of persisted throughout my life, really. I'm more at peace with it now. I say generally I'm more at peace with my OCD than I ever have been. I maybe have 1 or 2 flare-ups a year at most.
Okay.
But when it does happen, it fucking knocks me for 6.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you want me to continue, or if there's another specific question that you want to ask me that might feel better to.
No, I don't think better or worse. I am interested in I was going to ask before you said this, how that evolved or transformed over time. This isn't my sort of second formal question, let's say, but this is sort of what you've described so far is sort of between the ages of like what seems like maybe 10 and 13. And you're, in your late 20s now, like, is it 29 or 30? So there's
actually 26.
26, sorry, 26. So then there's that whole 14-year period where that's not that you haven't described as such. And I was sort of curious about how, you said it persisted. Was it that was the main one, and every time it happened, you did end up then becoming exhausted from that cycle and then going to bed or whatever you would do next? Because I know at the same time you've been fairly busy in terms of your developing your career over the last 10 years. So I'm curious about how that continued to play out over time as you continued to grow and develop, both into your sexuality but also into your adulthood.
Sure. So I would say maybe 14 or 15 was probably the closest that I've ever come to a mental breakdown,
right,
as a result of my OCD.
Right.
And these were all of these 2 main categories of obsessions. Sort of, it's almost as if one would sort of raise its voice, then when it shut up, the other one would the other voice would come out, and it would be the other fear.
And it is all about harming people globally, like even the pedophilic OCD and the sort of fear of being a violent killer. They're both fears of harming others. Was that the core theme of all of it? If you take away the the sort of the sort of specific details? Is it all fear of harm?
Definitely. Around this time actually, and this is, I suppose, was an eye-opener, but at the same time did fuck all to relieve me, I suppose, which is one of the reasons why I always say to clients now that if you're feeling anxious about something or you're unsure about a particular health issue, don't go to Dr. Google. It doesn't help. At best, it doesn't assuage the anxiety, and at worst, it can actually exacerbate it. But I remember I started to do a bit of research about what I was going through, and harm OCD was something that I read article after article after article about. Harm OCD. If we talk about paedophile OCD as a very specific subsection, it's a very specific subsection of harm OCD, which is like a section of an overall overarching OCD.
Yeah, because it's not the same as contamination necessarily, is it? The harm OCD.
No, but I found out later there's even more layers than that. So harm OCD is actually below an overarching OCD, which is called pure O, which is where people, like I did, tend to experience OCD that is predominantly obsessions with minimal active compulsions outside of, ruminating and things like that. But I did start to read about harm OCD, and I remember reading articles about, you hear it a lot with women who, after they've had children, it's very common for women to develop postpartum depression. One thing I did not know was a thing was postpartum OCD. I remember reading articles about women having intrusive thoughts about smothering their babies, putting them in the oven, sexually abusing them, and they sort of combat that by sort of checking their child every 30 seconds to make sure they were still breathing when they were asleep. I also read articles and forums where people shared experiences similar to mine. But on some level, I almost had an idea in my head of, okay, this is something. This is a thread that potentially could explain why I am the way that I am. But like with like with any form of obsession that I'd had previously, there was still a niggling doubt. There was still room for error in that argument. I almost sort of made sort of the assumption in my head, it's like, oh, all these people have OCD and my experiences are very similar to theirs, but unlike them, there is something fundamentally wrong and evil about me, and I'm an actual risk. Doubt was enough to sort of keep it going.
It's hardly a doubt. It's like the belief, the feeling that there was something wrong with you was attached very deeply to this idea that you could be guilty of these things, or guilty or of being this person, being this way. That sort of core belief element to it of there is something wrong with me. It's almost not a doubt, it's a conviction that again acts as evidence for the OCD, for the intrusions and the mental compulsions.
Absolutely. And with the OCD, because of the fear, shame, guilt that it generates, oftentimes people with OCD also experience that comorbidly with depression, which I certainly did as well. Those crashes, they weren't. That was just depression. That was depression sort of sweeping and going, right, anxiety, you've had enough here. Take a breather. We're sort of going to sit there and stew in your own self-loathing, because that at that moment was a better alternative than sort of going round and round in your head. And there was a period where things improved for a little while, but when I was around the age of 15, and I suppose this is one of the few examples that I can actually think of where I engaged in actual compulsions, physical actions. I began to self-harm at that age, and struggled with that for a very long time, actually, probably until I was about 20, 21. Started off with cutting, and then as I got older, I do things like burn myself, slap myself, that sort of thing. But at the
Are these
time,
in relation
cutting,
to the intrusions? Like, are these responses to the intrusions?
it certainly started off that way.
Okay.
When the cutting was something that was very prevalent, more so when I was 15 or 16, which is when it started and then really escalated.
Yeah.
Because the cutting made sense to me, because it would normally start with the thought of, okay, I've let a friend down, I've pissed off a friend, I've upset, my mum or dad, I've not been a good son, I've not been a good student, I've not been a good friend, whatever it may be. And in my mind, my way of making up for that was by hurting myself,
Right.
to sort of absolve myself of the wrongdoing
Right.
the perceived wrongdoing that I had done.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the cutting made sense for that reason, because my OCD was, and the reason why it was connected to the OCD was like, well, if you cut yourself once for every single letter of that person's name,
Right.
you have absolved yourself of guilt.
Right.
So that's what I would
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
So, your name's Ed Christmas. So if I felt like I'd done that wrong, so 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, I'd cut. If for example, I felt like
Yeah.
I'd hurt you in some way,
Yeah. Yeah.
just as a purely hypothetical example, I'd
I
cut myself
understand.
12
Yeah.
times.
Yeah.
Um,
And you said that ended when you were in your early 20s. Why or how?
yes. Well, the self harm was started off as being very specific. It was a very specific sort of means to an end. There was no real it there was an element of punishment to it, but it wasn't a way of me dealing with depression or
Mm.
feeling numb or whatever it may be. The way that it started was very much about punishment and atonement.
Yeah.
But as time went on, and because I went through something very traumatic when I was 16. My mum was diagnosed with cancer when I was doing my GCSEs. I wasn't told until afterwards. And
Right.
then 6 weeks later, she died unexpectedly, very
Yeah.
unexpectedly and very suddenly,
Right.
which was the most traumatic thing I think I've ever been through. And
Yeah.
with that, the OCD did subside for a little while.
Mm.
And what sort of replaced that was depression,
Yeah.
quite severe depression, but also just periods of numbness. I mean, there are periods of that time that the first 3 months after my mum died, there are bits of it that I just cannot remember.
Yeah.
And the self-harm at that stage escalated to the point that it was something that I just did. It was just, there was
Yeah.
no rhyme or reason that I could see at the time behind what I was doing. It was just as much a part of routine as, brushing my teeth or showering or going to college or whatever.
Right.
And after that, there was a departure between the self-harm and the OCD,
Yeah.
and the self-harm became more ingrained with depression, which is
Right.
I still experience now to a much lesser extent, but that became a lot more prevalent in my
Yeah.
life, and it was something that I did for a long time.
Yeah.
The self-harm came out in other ways too. So um, I always had issues around, for as long as I remember, I've always had issues around my weight and food and body image and all the rest of it, because I used to be overweight, slightly overweight when I was a kid, as a lot of kids
Okay.
are.
Yeah.
And the food became an obsession, because I remember when I was about 13, I was pretty heavy, and then I started going to the gym, I started counting calories, all the rest of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that was almost a bit like a phase to some extent. It never really sort of reared its head properly for a long time. And then
Right.
when I was around 18, 19,
Yeah.
I started to engage in what I now know was, because I was diagnosed it later, I now know to be anorexia.
Right.
And I severely limited what I was eating. I would abuse things like diet pills, diuretics, laxatives, and reduce my calorie intake, and I became severely underweight.
Right.
Which, again, something that is very common. People with OCD, there is often a comorbidity between OCD and eating disorders. The self-harm, again, no, the self-harm through the eating disorder wasn't necessarily linked to my OCD, although the OCD would come out in terms of checking behaviors, but more so checking myself physically. So I would, put my finger and my thumb, around my wrist, and if I was able to do that, I was thin enough. I would constantly be breathing in. I'd be feeling, making sure I could feel all my ribs through my spine. I'd weigh myself multiple times a day. Which I definitely see a parallel between the OCD behaviour in that, although the connection wasn't really clear. But I suppose, to answer your question about when the self-harm sort of subsided, including, I would say for the most part, the disordered eating, was when I went to uni to do my counselling degree. And as you know, the personal therapy is a requirement for the course, and I would argue still should be a requirement for therapists going forward, but that's just me, and I don't think the BACD could ever enforce that. But I was seeing a counsellor at the time that I had been seeing before going to uni, whilst I was going through the anorexia, and she helped me develop a sense of self-respect and self-love. And I think when you're doing a counselling course, it's very difficult to not learn. It's very difficult to hear different ways of being and challenging, negative self-perceptions and where these things come from and conditions of worth and all of that stuff, and not internalize that to some degree. And
not make your own process of see how these sort of human psychological traits also apply to you, right? That we are also part of that sort of I want to say bath or soup of like what it means to be human, and the psychology and the societal conditioning that happens. It definitely makes you more aware of it.
There's comfort. There's liberation and comfort to be found in finding out that we're all pretty fucked up. So with that, I think because I had that self-esteem, although I still had issues with anorexia and restrictive eating for a couple more years after that, so I was still engaging in restrictive eating for another couple of years after that. Ironically, it actually stopped during lockdown. I say ironically because in a lot of cases people's addictive behaviors got worse, but mine actually got better. But the self-harm just kind of stopped then. I guess I didn't feel the need to punish myself to such a strong degree.
Punishment is something that, when you mentioned punishment and atonement, it sort of led me to my second question, which I know we've been here for a while and we're only on question 2, but I appreciate the level of detail and honesty that you're willing to express. So my second question was, how does OCD relate to religion and sexuality? Because you mentioned earlier that when you started recognizing or thinking that you were gay, or recognizing that you were gay, or that you are gay, that connected to this concept of pedophilia and degeneracy, right? And then later you talk about the self-harm in relation to atonement, punishment and atonement, which is a very Christian motif in some ways. And so it made me think back to that second question of how may or did OCD relate to religion and sexuality for you, or in general, based on your experience?
I think I want preface what I'm about to say, because I do have a lot of thoughts about the connection between
Yeah.
being raised Catholic and how my OCD manifests itself.
Yeah.
I don't want to sort of look at it in, and I'd encourage anyone who's listening to not look at it in such an oversimplistic way, in that religion was the primary motivating factor behind my OCD. I think there are multiple contributing factors, both nature and nurture, which I'm happy to talk about later, that contributed to me developing this. But I will say this: it didn't fucking help.
Yeah.
When people talk about OCD, and I think it's actually really useful to sort of look at CBT theory and irrational thoughts to sort of make sense of OCD. And I think I can't remember whether it's CBT or REBT, but they talk about one of the irrational thoughts being black and white thinking.
Yeah.
If you're prone to black and white thinking anyway, being raised in organized religion, and I can only speak for being raised in the Catholic faith, particularly in organized religion, that is quite punitive, and is very, I would argue, has a very oversimplified view of morality about what's good, what's evil. Didn't help at all.
Because it reinforces the black and white thinking, right? Just to clarify, black and white thinking, if you haven't heard the term, it's just binary thinking. It's either good or bad. It's either evil, or all good. And it kind of comes down to like fight or flight response. Like in that moment of immediate response to a threat, you need to have a very quick yes, this is dangerous, or no, this isn't dangerous response. And so things get categorized very quickly and often irrationally into that kind of either black or white boxes. And of course, that's fine if there is a real threat. But if there's not a real threat, in the case of OCD, for example, where the threat is an imagined belief or an imagined future, often anyway, then if it becomes black and white thinking, if that gets locked in, then it's very difficult to not follow into that sort of trap and then put more and more stuff into I'm bad because I had a bad thought, and that sort of way of processing these much more complicated experiences, right?
Most definitely, yeah. I think that's a beaut. I couldn't have put that better myself. I think, yeah, it's non-binary. Fucking hell, binary thinking.
Yeah.
Binary thinking is, as I agree with you, it's useful if you're in a situation where you have to respond quickly.
Yeah.
But when you internalize that and it dominates every aspect of your life, it's not great. So,
and you were saying that Catholicism at least had elements of that with regards to morality for you, again?
Most definitely. I mean, I think as a kid, those sort of messages went over my head. Like a lot of Catholic churches, in my catechism, there was a Sunday school. So after, the opening sort of hymns and homilies and stuff like that, maybe 10, 15 minutes into the mass, all the kids would be sort of gathered and taken to a separate building that was attached to the church for Sunday school, basically.
Yeah.
And I went through all of that. I went through Holy Communion, all that stuff. And I didn't really, those messages, I think, went over my head when I was a kid because, we learn about all the exciting stories of the Bible, like Noah and the Ark and Samson and Delilah. And for me, it was an opportunity to, hear really fun stories. Lots of doodling and colouring in, because we'd have these sort of drawings. We were given these prints of like various religious scenes with gaps that you could sort of colour in and stuff like that. It was that, but also an opportunity to hang out with friends and kids my own age. I didn't really think much of it.
Yeah.
But it must have, to some extent, that message I must have internalized it. Yeah. Because for those who aren't necessarily familiar, the Catholic Church's stance on homosexuality is it's not a sin, to be attracted to someone of the same sex. There's nothing inherently unnatural or immoral about that, but it is a sin to engage in homosexual acts for multiple reasons. One, it's sex that cannot result in reproduction, which is again why the Catholic Church also has a very unhealthy stance on masturbation and self-discovery, which I could go on a rant about for a long time, but I won't. But also that there is an idea that marriage is between a man and a woman. Therefore, gay people will never be married in the Catholic Church. Therefore, having and sex is something that is assigned purely for the marital bed. So therefore, no matter which way you slice it, if you're gay, you essentially have to deny yourself the opportunity to connect with someone,
sexually,
on a romantic or sexual level, a loving level, in order to be a good Catholic.
To be and good Catholic in this sense, sorry if I may, good Catholic in this sense means worthy in the eyes of God.
Worthy in the eyes of God in terms of how the Catechism sees being worthy in the eyes of God, because because Christianity as a world, because it is a world religion, it's absolutely huge, and
yes, of course,
there are various denominations, and Catholics, for example, will have a very different opinion on homosexuality to the Church of England, for example. So the Church of England, although it varies from from diocese to diocese, there will be Church of England priests who will be willing to marry gay couples. And they don't have such and again, I get the impression, and I cannot speak from personal experience, their attitude towards sex, marriage, love isn't quite as militant as the Catholic one. And I would say it is very much based on the Catechism specifically, because the Catechism, the most recent edition, just to give you an idea of how slow as an organisation they move. The most recent Catechism, I believe, was in between 67 to 69, and it was. I get the impression that it was. Again, I also don't feel like I can comment on this accurately, because I'm the definition of a lapsed Catholic. I haven't gone to church in a very, very long time, so I'm as ignorant as any other person who's not a part of that world. But I get the impression that the Catechism was a document that was written in response to changing social mores at the time. So in 1967, we had the Sexual Offences Act 1967, which decriminalised homosexual behaviour in the privacy of one's bedroom. That if two people were consenting adults, although the age of consent wasn't made equal until later, it's fine. There was no legality with that, provided it was done behind closed doors and both people were consenting.
But the Catechism didn't take that stance, or
no. The Catechism stance were, as I said, homosexuality is not a sin.
So remained. But the acts themselves were frowned upon, to say the least.
And I say that it was a document that I think was a response to, what was going on at the time, because it was in the Catechism that the Catholic Church also made its stance on things like abortion and euthanasia very clear as well. So I didn't learn that until much later, when I was in secondary school, because I went to Catholic junior, Catholic infant school, Catholic junior school, Catholic secondary school, and I went to a secular sixth form as soon as I turned 16, because I just wanted to get the fuck out of there.
Was that a response to the teaching around sexuality, or something else that you wanted to get out?
I think that there was a combination of things, really. I mean, at the age where I was really starting to, okay, there's no doubt in my mind. I mean, I'm not straight. I did the typical thing that a lot of gay men do, which is uh, uh, come out as bisexual initially and then
Yeah.
come out as gay later, because I think in my mind, there was some internalized homophobia going on. Well, okay, I'm a
Yeah.
degenerate, but at least being attracted to women as well makes it less
Half as
wrong.
bad.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And then,
Yeah.
I discovered, actually being part of the LGBTQ plus community, that there's actually a lot of biphobia, so you can't fucking win. So
Classic.
anyway, so I was learning about this stuff in religious studies, and conversations around, homosexuality and abortion and stuff like that would come up in class, and we'd have debates about it. And there was just, it was a really strange dichotomy for me, because actually I loved my teacher who
Yeah.
taught it, and I still have a lot of respect for her. She was a very compassionate woman,
Yeah.
very knew how to engage kids, didn't take any bullshit, wouldn't bullshit you, and I just really, really liked her.
Yeah.
If you can hear that, that's my bird clock. Every
That's
hour
okay.
it's a sound of a different British songbird.
Fair enough.
But there was a really confusing sense of, okay, I really like and respect this woman, but because I got the impression that she actually aligned with a lot of these views.
Yeah.
It was the dichotomy between, okay, I really respect this woman, but at the same time, she doesn't necessarily believe in my right to exist freely. And that didn't make me
Yeah.
angry. I just found it to be very confusing.
Yeah.
Um, what I also experienced at that time as well, that was arguably more traumatic, was I experienced bullying from the age of about 11 to 14 when I was in secondary school.
This is the Catholic secondary you're mentioning.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So for a multitude of reasons, as I said to you before, I was slightly overweight when I was a kid, so my weight was a topic of ridicule, because that's just,
Yeah.
kids are shit, kids are little shits, and that's just how they
Yeah.
are.
Yeah.
It was also a rugby school.
Right.
I'm not athletic in the least,
Right.
so I didn't feel like I fit in that way. Um, I It was a science school as well. I was always more creative.
Yeah.
And also, I just think in general, looking back, I was a precocious little shit, and I probably irritated the fuck out of people around me. So I
Uh-huh.
found making friends quite difficult, and the bullying was something that was a part of my life for those
Mm.
first 3 years. But when I was 13,
Yeah.
I actually started to experiment with boys in my year
Yeah.
at school,
Yeah.
and it was all done secretly.
Mm-hmm.
Normally, it would be done um, in the toilets during school. Very, very
Uh-huh.
classy, I know. And these guys we'd fool around, and then as soon as it would finish, they'd tell me, like, they say, "Oh, if you tell anyone, I'll kill you," sort of thing. Or they tell me afterwards that they didn't actually want to do what I'd just done, implying that I'd somehow
Abuse
pressured
them.
them, or
Yeah.
abused them, or
Yeah.
assaulted them, which
Yeah.
didn't help my forming ideas about my sexuality at the time.
Yeah. Or
And
about
people would
yourself,
sort of huh?
or about yourself, the adolescence is all just about, it's not just about developing sexuality, it's about developing identity, isn't it? So,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
It sort of fed in. It definitely fed into this negative self-image that I had of
Yeah.
myself.
Yeah.
Although weirdly, I also remember, just for at least those first couple of years, don't know where I got it from. Maybe I got it from my mum. She was half Italian, so she was pretty fiery and was very much about, not appearing to be submissive and all the rest of it. And
Yeah.
so I think maybe that's where I found that sense of not self-esteem, but
Mm.
self-possession, despite
Mm.
the fact that I was a very anxious and fearful kid.
Mm.
Um, and people sort of made comments about my sexuality
Mm.
before. I'd even sort of started to connect with what that was, people assumed that I was gay for a multitude of reasons. I think one, I know it's not necessarily the most politically correct thing to say, but I think sometimes being around someone, you can pick up a vibe, gaydar, whatever you want to call it. You can get an impression of, okay, this person, maybe queer or part of the larger LGBTQ plus community at large. And I think children are very good at identifying difference in other kids, because like you said, being a teenager, the biggest task is finding out where you belong, and the goal is social cohesion. Therefore, if you sniff out difference, you're going to pick up on it and you're going to respond quite negatively to it. But people make comments about my sexuality all the time, assumed that I was gay. Turns out assumed correctly. And I remember when I got into year 9, there were 3 people that were particularly vicious in regards to the bullying.
Right.
One of them, ironically, was someone that I was experimenting with sexually at the time. But the other 2 were very vicious towards me. And I remember one of them, and this is probably why I'm such a big proponent, and I say to my clients all the time, coming out should be your choice, and nobody can tell you when to do it. That only you can decide when's the right time. I'm a big advocate of that, because one of the bullies has sort of essentially said to me or implied to me that if I came out, they would have more respect for me. And which in my mind, I thought the implication was clear that, okay, the bullying would stop. So which is when I then came out as bisexual.
Right.
And the bullying did stop, but for about 3 days. And then it escalated. One of them actually came up to me and said, completely unprompted and unannounced, so I'll never forget it for as long as I live, he said to me, "Have you figured out a way to kill yourself yet?" And those 2 boys in particular, when I asked them, because there were a couple of times where I would sort of defend myself and ask them what their issue was, and one of them basically said that they hated gays because the Bible said so.
And that was enough.
But then when I made the points, then it's like, well, I'm pretty sure sex outside of marriage is a sin according to Catholicism, but I'm pretty sure if a girl offered to suck you off at a party, you wouldn't say no. So there was very much and they didn't have anything to say in response to that. So it's very much a bias against my sexuality. So the religious angle was bullshit. It didn't come directly from religious prejudice. It's just that religion was used as a permission basis and a justification for the fact that they were just being cunts, really. I wish them well now, and I do genuinely. That sounds glib, but in all seriousness, I do genuinely believe that people can grow and change and develop. And I think my generation was a weird one in that we came into a culture and a society where homosexuality was something that was being more tolerated, and I fucking hate that word. When people say to me, it's like, oh yeah, people around me were really tolerant of my sexuality. I'm sorry, sexuality isn't something to be fucking tolerated. Anyway, we were coming as you can tell, I'm still quite passionate about this. We were coming into a culture where homosexuality was something that was a lot of stigma was taken away, but in terms of how it was portrayed by media, it was still very much a heteronormative angle. There was still very much an underlying current or a belief system that homosexuality was less preferable to heterosexuality. So because this is the thing, I never heard homophobia directly from church.
Mm.
I certainly never received it from my parents, and after the bullying happened and escalated, and I actually finally did pluck up the courage to tell someone. Um, it did stop, and I was actually able to form a group of friends
Mm.
at the time who I was friends with until I left school.
Mm.
A couple of them I'm still in touch with. And I think after that, the shame related to my sexuality dissipated, but I don't think it's ever wholly
Mm.
gone away.
Mm.
Um, but to answer your point, I don't think being raised Catholic made this shame and this OCD mindset around my sexuality. I'm not saying that being
Yeah.
raised Catholic caused that, but it didn't help.
Yeah. Yeah. You got added more evidence in the way that you might say that you were describing earlier, that part of the OCD was having an intrusion and then trying to present evidence against the intrusion, like, and so it becomes a sort of a weighing, a battle of like weight, like
Yeah.
how much weight is there on one side or the other.
Yeah.
Catholicism and its teachings around sexuality and morality.
Yeah, but unlike but
Didn't
unlike
add.
but unlike Catholicism and religious dogma,
Yeah.
um, at least within within religious dogma, there's a very clear black and white. This is right. This is wrong. If you've got
Yeah.
OCD, the
Yeah.
evidence that you find is never good enough.
Yeah.
There
Yeah.
is no resolve.
Yeah. Yeah. This kind of brings me to my third question, which was, I mean, they're shifting around a bit based on what we're talking about, but my third question was kind of about, you say that you're further away from the sort of terror of the OCD now, and that made me want to ask how you kind of resolved parts of it, how you worked to treat the OCD within yourself, and you mentioned counselling training, but I know there's a story there that would be very interesting to hear in more detail about how you worked on it to become more comfortable with yourself, right?
Sure, I'm happy to answer that because it's something I have thought about a lot. I'd say my relationship with my OCD was pretty bad until about 2 years ago.
Right.
Up until that point, I was managing my OCD with medication. So
Yeah.
first of all, sertraline, and
Yeah.
then fluoxetine, which I still take.
Right.
I was diagnosed officially when I was 17,
Yeah.
but in terms of my counselling training, that was still very much there. I not helped by the fact that in my first year of my counselling training, we had to deliver a presentation about for our mental health module,
Yeah.
and I looked at the list of sort of audited topics that were selected, and OCD was one of them.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that I would, give a presentation about OCD and relate it to my own experiences.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I covered was the paedophile OCD angle and
Yeah.
the general harm, overarching harm OCD narrative that was sort of there.
Yeah.
And we had a process group, and for those who aren't familiar, those who are listening who aren't familiar with the counselling world, we do this really fun thing in our training called process group, where we all sit in a circle and we share honestly our feelings about each other.
Mm.
And it's about, I can only speak for myself, I'm sure that other courses managed it a lot better. It's a very beautiful healing thing. But my experience of process group, and to anyone who did the same course as me can probably attest this, was a clusterfuck and was about as uncomfortable as it sounds.
Yeah.
And I remember not long after delivering my presentation, maybe a week or two later, we had process group.
Mm-hmm.
And I was asked by a member of my class who clearly didn't understand where I was coming from.
Mm.
also disclosed that there was a history of sexual abuse in her family.
Yeah.
So I understand why she asked that question, but she essentially asked me outright if I was a paedophile.
Mm.
And I think as a result of that, I went into my shell for a long time about the OCD.
Yeah.
Any sort of resolution I had was gone temporarily.
Yeah.
I was having therapy for a couple. Well, I'm still in therapy now, but when my counselling training finished, I was referred on by my counsellor that I was seeing at the time. I'd been seeing her at this point for 3 years. She
Mhm.
referred me on because I feel like she couldn't crack the OCD. She didn't know what to do with it anymore, and we'd sort of reached a natural ending. So I ended up with a therapist who specialised in addiction.
Yeah.
Because another thing that OCD can manifest itself as, but also trauma can manifest itself as, is hypersexuality. So I was ascribed these labels of not only having obsessive compulsive disorder, but also having an eating disorder and
Yeah.
sex addiction.
Yeah.
And I actually took part in 12-step groups. So I was part of Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous and Eating Disorders Anonymous. Now, there is a point I'm about to make, but those groups, although I think the 12 steps are wonderful for some people and they've proven to be very effective,
Yeah.
for someone whose sense of themselves in the world is very much based in shame.
Yeah.
I think especially for someone who's got OCD and has very black and white thinking, being part of those fellowships actually made things worse.
Right.
And my therapist, who actually recommended that I go to the 12 steps, try as he might, as much as he was trying to help,
Yeah.
I was almost sort of getting contradictory messages from him versus, which sort of ties back very neatly to the organized religion thing. Therapy is more about not looking at things in black and white way and challenging self-perception, whereas the 12-step groups was too similar to organized religion for my,
Right.
for comfort. So things actually got worse.
Yeah.
But while I was seeing this therapist, I underwent some training with a psychotherapist who, for about a year or so, became my supervisor.
Right.
And we did, as part of one of the organisations that I work for, we had over 2 weekends, we had 4 days worth of trauma training.
Right.
And I fell in love with it. We learned, we learned about, sort of the basics of trauma, like the neuropsychology of it, fight or flight response, autonomic nervous system, and which I loved, and all of these things. But one of the things that I actually fell in love with, that I suppose didn't really plant a seed. It did plant a seed, but I didn't really make sense of it until later.
Yeah.
Was something called internal family systems.
Yeah.
And I know that it's something that you
Adore. Yes. Yes,
yeah.
I do.
So do you want to maybe give a summary of what?
Yeah, okay. So this is my understanding of IFS as I experienced and understood it again. So this is very personal to my view of it, and everyone, I think, will have a different experience of this. But fundamentally, the core concept is that we are. We as individuals are a combination of our kind of self, our sense of the person who observes and witnesses life as it's happening, and our parts. And our parts are kind of like embedded versions of memories and experiences and internalized concepts of other people that, we gained through experiences, through learning things. And they kind of create what would be called an internal family system. And family system is important because the purpose of the family is that there's certain roles that need to be filled, and some of them are about protecting, and some of them are about some of them are protectors, and some of them are vulnerable. And so it becomes kind of a balancing act. Our parts work together to kind of balance the system to make sure that it's safe, because the primary order of animal life, right, is about individual safety before everything else. And so internal family systems seeks to help people through kind of talking therapy and kind of imagination and access to our parts to resolve the problems that have become stuck, and to help understand and create more compassion, and eventually through that process of compassion and understanding and collaboration between self and parts and the therapist, if there is one, you learn to find new ways of managing threat, of new ways of managing problems, and of course, naturally, finding new ways of seeing and understanding yourself, with the idea of becoming more compassionate, more open, and more free, right? Because the problem of parts is often they get stuck not only in their trauma, but also in their responses to the trauma. And you could see a lot of different mental disorders, for lack of a better word, as these kind of stuck responses to a perceived threat, or to, OCD is a good example. I see myself as a potential violent killer, so I create a response to that threat, and then the response itself becomes its own problem, and then they get locked in together, and then years go by, and it's become a habit, and often a worsening habit, because often it stops working as well. So you need to create more layers to that so that it maintains its efficacy, and then you get very complicated, very the word you used earlier, very debilitating habits, for lack of a better word. I don't know if that summarizes IFS perfectly, but that's kind of how I would often think about it to myself. It's the internal system is very complex and has almost like individuals that live in us, that we are made up of, and it's about filtering through them and helping them become less afraid and less stuck in their own world and their own experience. Is that where you'd put it?
Yeah, that is I think you put it better than I could.
Yeah.
But for me, I think as someone who is an OCD sufferer, something like internal family systems, I think it is brilliant as a way of challenging the black and white thinking that comes with OCD, because it forces you to look at yourself in an overarching, nuanced way. And the only thing that I want to add to that, it's to make it specific to my experience, and I suppose to make it specific to the experience of people who might be listening, is the different names that we give the parts, right? So
please.
So you mentioned, so there's several main components. We've got the please jump in and correct me if I
go for it.
And I'm not IFS trained by any means. I'm just very passionate about it. So you've got the self, and the idea of the self in IFS, I think, borrows from a lot of philosophical ideas, including Buddhism, which basically argues that the self is a permanent, everlasting state of being, and we feel that we are in self when we feel connected to other people, when we feel connected to ourselves, when we feel creative, where we feel curious, where we feel calm, where we feel confident. Basically, the best versions of ourself is when we are in self. And then we also have these adjoining parts, which all of us have. So there's two parts really. There's managers and firefighters. And the main distinction between the two is that managers are proactive and are constantly preparing for things, and our firefighters are reactive and they respond immediately. And when
the only interruption I'll say here is that I don't know if you're about to mention this. There's the third type of part, which is exiles, which are the kind of muffled ones, the things that trauma tends to get stuck as.
Exactly. I was gonna that leads me really beautifully on to my next point. When the system is, or the family rather, is not burdened by trauma, the system's working pretty well. Everyone's playing their role, and it's all going pretty tickety-boo. So I would argue that the manager is the thing that, when it's not burdened with trauma, is the thing that, helps you. I don't know, if you're about to go on holiday or something, you need to prepare an itinerary of things that you need to do. So, for example, make sure you have your passport, that make sure you go to, your local shop and exchange sterling for wherever you're going, getting things packed, getting things organized. When the manager is in a good place, it's a very useful, organized part of ourselves. And the firefighter, I think, it is the thing that sort of steps in to help us get out of, sort of everyday dangerous situations. So, for example, if you're crossing the road and unexpectedly somebody's driving very quickly down the road, your firefighter is the thing that makes you sort of step back and, sort of keep yourself safe.
Yeah.
And overall, the self is the thing that's presiding over it. It's a rational part, but it's also a very compassionate part. And the self is sort of seen as the boss in this sort of situation.
As the compassionate parent, it's very much in a healthy system. It's a loving, compassionate, understanding, nurturing parent without becoming over involved. It's kind of got that very balanced sense to it.
Most definitely. But then if somebody goes through trauma, what happens is that another part is created, as you said, that is, contains the memory of that traumatic event, the time of that traumatic event, the space of that traumatic event, and develops a part called an exile, which, as you said, it's muffled because that is the part that is seen as responsible by both the managers and the firefighters as being responsible for the trauma. So what happens when the managers and the firefighters get burdened with trauma? They panic, they freak out, and as a necessary defense mechanism, they shield the
system.
Yeah, they shield the system, but most importantly, they shield the self from these exiles, because if they believe that if the self is exposed to the exile and is exposed to the trauma that's attached to that exile, the self will collapse and essentially the rest of the system collapse with it. So what happens is clients will often come to therapy and say, I don't know who I am. It's not that the self has gone anywhere, it's just it's become overshadowed by these two competing parts that, one, behave very differently, and two, don't like each other very much. Basically trying to overshadow the self so that they're not exposed to the trauma that's underneath. And to make it more general, firefighter behavior, manager behavior, when it's burdened by trauma, can come out in, as you said, things that we would identify as disorders. So a manager that is burdened with trauma, that might come out in things like, severe anxiety.
When you think about severe anxiety, especially general anxiety like worry anxiety, you can very closely see how it's a part of you, and the language of parts is just trying to take that seriously as it is. But we would normally say there's a part of me that constantly worries about the future, and it's this idea that like there is a sense of the world is a scary place, often because of trauma, and this manager part, it's their job. They see. We feel that it's their job to worry so that they can prepare us and make sure that we don't go into the same places, into the same threats. And you can see how clearly, if that's constant, if it feels the constant pressure to worry, to be preparing the system, then you've got constant anxiety. And then,
Absolutely. And it's sort of, the anxiety is necessitated by the situation. If the event that the person goes through is traumatic enough, or it's a traumatic event that happens either multiple times or over a long period of time, it becomes necessary for that part to be present. It makes sense if you're being sexually abused, for example, as a child. It makes sense to be on high alert constantly and to have a sense of general anxiety and dread and threat, because you're trying to keep yourself safe from that. But oftentimes what happens is that the system takes a while to catch up. So anyway, going back to other manager behavior, that can also be a harsh inner critic, which we all have. That could be the part that is, very driven to the point that career and success is prioritized above everything else. So that's some of the ways in which anxiety, in which the manager can come out. Firefighters can also come out when it's burdened with trauma. Firefighters can manifest themselves as things like eating disorders, self-harm, suicidal thoughts, depression, chronic fatigue, because essentially what the role of the manager is at that point is
The
to help the
firefighter,
person.
sorry.
Yeah, thank you. I always get them. You're
That's
right.
okay.
The job or the role of the firefighter in that moment is to help the person escape from their current situation. And oftentimes they work hand in hand with each other. Even though they don't like each other very much, the manager normally gets the system into such a state that's exhausted, after which the firefighter then comes in to sort of go, it's okay, we can sort of, you know, distract, think about something else, which is why often depression and anxiety go hand in hand with each other. The person gets so exhausted that then the depression comes in to sort of give the body a rest.
Eating disorders is a good example of this point, I think, because at least in one particular form of eating disorder, it's like there's the manager that is a self-critic, right? That constantly sends the messaging that you're fat and you need to stop eating as much and that kind of thing, so that because it wants you to act differently. It wants you to be good enough. It wants you to be safe, in other words, right? To be lovable and worthy. And so it uses this method of criticism and of kind of a hassle, kind of abuse to get you there. And then when that becomes exhausting, or when it becomes quieter, the binge eating comes in, and the binge eating is the firefighter who says, no, we're going to get away from these negative feelings, and we're going to feel better. We're going to feel comfortable when we eat. And then you eat, and the firefighter kicks in, and you binge eat because it's also disordered. And then after you finished eating, there's now more reason for the manager to come in and say, look what you've done. Now you've done it again. Look at how shit you are, etc., etc. And they keep flipping between the two. And again, it's like this trap, isn't it? Because you're locked in at that point. One makes you do one thing. One makes you do the thing that makes the firefighter want to become more active, which then triggers the manager.
Absolutely. And the manager in that moment, thinking of a specific eating disorder, the binge eating, and then the shame that follows that, go, what the fuck have you done? The desire to control, which then triggers another firefighter behavior, forcing yourself to throw, of making yourself sick. Of that. And that's something that can apply to any eating disorder, really. I mean, I can certainly speak from my experiences of anorexia, that because my anorexia develops at a time in my life where things felt very much outside of my control, and I was in a lot of emotional pain, but the pain was so intense that I wasn't able to feel it, or my system, my parts didn't let me feel it. So the anorexia sort of develops because it dealing with the physical pain of hunger and getting weaker and being cold all the time was much better. It felt like a much safer alternative to actually feeling, or connecting with the exile underneath that. And the exile underneath that was just a scared 19-year-old kid who didn't know what the fuck he was going to do, where his life was going.
To put it in simpler terms, it's like the restrictive eating is controlled, and the feeling underneath is absolute terror of being absolutely out of control.
And it's the same with any addiction, any alcoholism, for example. It's the same thing. Any form of behavior that could be identified as addictive is a firefighter part that is trying to hide the real trauma and pain underneath. I really do believe in Gabor Mate when he says that addiction, but I would sort of, paraphrase that to extend that to any form of behavior that we would say, in bunny years, be self-destructive. It's not about the addiction, it's about pain relief. And to bring it into my OCD, I describe my OCD as being a manager that is under every stimulant under the sun that you can imagine. So cocaine, nicotine, caffeine, diet pills, caffeine pills, just everything. And one of the things that I think is really nice about IFS, one of the primary sort of tenets of IFS is that in order to become more connected to the self, we need to connect to our parts.
Yeah.
And oftentimes that can seem contradictory. Why would I want to listen to the most self-destructive part of myself? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But actually, ignoring those parts can
Yeah.
actually lead to the behavior exacerbating. I use the analogy a lot with clients. It's one that certainly helped me. If you're on imagine being on an airplane and you look out the window and you realize the plane is crashing. Your response would realistically, not in terms of how we imagine we'd respond, we wouldn't imagine heroically, we'd
Yeah.
probably do a combination of shit ourselves and start screaming. And what would then happen if this reality was still there, the plane was still crashing, but you would look around the cabin and people just chatting amongst themselves, reading the in-flight magazines, not taking any bit of notice? You'd probably say, scream even louder and go, what the fuck are you people doing?
Yeah.
And that's why IFS
Yeah.
recommends that we actually connect to the parts in some ways, which is hard to do.
Yeah.
And we can either do that. I sort of look at it in a two-prong approach. We can either connect the parts by either trying to understand what the parts are protecting us from, which can be hard to do because it means potentially connecting with the exile,
Yeah.
and we can only connect with the exile if our managers and firefighters allow us to do so.
Yeah.
Or, and I find that this is the easier thing to do, we try and give them a bit of compassion, and that is very difficult to do for reasons that I've just said.
Yeah.
But actually, one of the things that we can do to develop compassion for those parts is to actually identify the ways in which those parts have contributed to our lives positively.
Yeah.
And for me, I really struggled with that. I could find positives in the depression, for example, because depression meant that I am, and I still suffer from depression. I go through bouts of it fairly regularly, but having depression means that as a result, I'm more in touch with what's happening in my body, and I'm aware if my social battery is starting to run down, and I'm more able to give myself permission to to rest, or to feel sorry for myself for a little while, which I think is a healthy thing in moderation to do. But with my OCD, it was the only disorder, again in bunny, but with bunny ears,
Mm-hmm.
that I could not find a single positive thing about. I was angry for having this because I thought it takes my mind to the darkest fucking places for no reason that I could see. And it was only when because it was quite serendipitous actually that I met this psychotherapist and did this training whilst I was also working as a student mentor at a local college at the same time, because I just set up a private practice and I was looking for ways to supplement my income. And my role was to I was basically there to monitor and support a group of young adult carers, because they were identified as being most at risk of low attendance, mental health difficulties, that sort of thing. And I did have to use my counselling skills in that job, because occasionally I'd invite students for one-to-one, and my role was basically help identify what the barriers were, to their education and all the rest of it, by looking at the difficulty or the trauma underneath, and then making practical steps forward. But the job, as anyone will attest to who works with children or young people, and all the red tape of working in those fields, the job also had a shitload of admin. So I had to make a record of every contact that I had with a student, whether that be face-to-face or remotely. I had to contact, teachers. I was also there sort of in a temporary role to replace another the main student mentor who had left. And so my job was also there to assist my colleague who was the head of student services in terms of things like photocopying, basically anything practical that needed to be done. And I discovered that I was actually very efficient at doing things. I was very conscientious about that sort of thing. I realise I don't think that I would have had such a great attention to detail, conscientiousness, were it not for my OCD. Because the thing is about OCD, if you're looking for evidence that isn't there, you do tend to become quite good at identifying things that aren't quite so obvious. Looking back, I realise that that's probably, contribute really positively to me in my academic career. I've always been a hard worker. I've always been very diligent when it comes to academia, which is why I did very well at school. Not so much sixth form, because that was the year that my mum died, and I was very angry, and I was skipping class and smoking weed, basically doing very moderate rebellion. After going to a very strict school, my idea of rebellion was dyeing my hair jet black, wearing black lipstick, and picking up smoking. So, but it also served me well when I went to uni. And I realised that, oh shit, I don't think that I would have that skill if it weren't for my OCD.
Yeah, that you wouldn't be so finely tuned. Yeah.
No, absolutely not. And I was just thinking, okay, that's interesting. This is worth looking into. And I think as a result of that, I've been able to identify more positive traits related to my OCD that actually now I'm grateful for. So,
what ones were there after that came after that first one? If I may, if there's...
Yeah, no worries. I mean, the conscientiousness was a big one, but also because if you've got OCD, your mind can take you to some pretty weird places. It also means you have quite a big capacity for creativity, and I paint and draw in my spare time, and I think that has certainly fueled that. Again, attention to detail has really helped as well.
Yeah.
And also I think it's assisted me in my work as a counsellor / psychotherapist, in the sense that I can connect and with my clients who might feel that there's something wrong with them, and there's very little at this stage that shocks me in terms of the places that the mind can go. And I think it's served well in terms of being able to normalise that for them.
I get you.
So I still have flare-ups like once or twice a year, but me and my OCD are on pretty good terms now.
Yeah, the changing relationship really is the core, of useful IFS or useful therapy in general, because therapy in general is taking a similar path towards a similar end. It's just using very different language and in some ways a very different approach. But you mentioned earlier that the self is being protected by the managers, and the firefighters, and the IFS process is to help the self regain presence in the system, and then for the self, you, to listen to the manager, to pay attention to it, but from that more compassionate adult and strong, that you can withstand these things. In some ways, that's what the therapist is doing in usual therapy. They are taking the role of the self who can listen and withstand until you learn that you can do it yourself, right? The client can do it themselves. It's just taking a different approach to that, which is more helping the person do it for themselves, with themselves, so that it becomes more of a habit, a new relationship internally, which is why I very much believe in how wonderful IFS is. Your last point made me want to move to the sort of last question and a half, because I think we've covered one of them more through the conversation about religion and sexuality. But one of them is the question that I need to ask, because I want to have this with every guest, is how comfortable are you with OCD, sexuality, religion, and sort of the mind now? You said that you've come to terms a bit more. Does that mean that you're comfortable with these parts, for lack of a better word?
I think it depends. it really does depend. I mean, I think
Mm.
for anyone who goes through mental health difficulties, whether it be depression or even fuck it, even if you're feeling ill, or
Yeah.
you're going through a proportion, a difficult time, which whether that be, I don't know, the stresses of moving house or work pressures or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
In those moments, your defenses your defenses aren't down. Your defenses come right the fuck up, because
Right.
it's necessary for those
Yeah. There's
protective
more
parts to come up.
vulnerability. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's still moments where I just think this is a pain in the arse,
Yeah.
having to deal with it. But I'm bringing it back to the IFS stuff.
Mm.
I am more in a position where the self is it is coming out more, and I am able
Mm.
to withstand these things when they come up.
Yeah.
I'd also be remiss if I didn't give credit to my therapist that I'm seeing at the moment.
Yeah.
So Alice, if you're listening, hi, who I've been seeing now for a year,
Yeah.
and she is she's a brilliant therapist who is able to withstand the things that I bring, and she has sort of weathered that storm with me. And through her
Yeah.
support, I have become more connected to myself. When you become more connected to yourself, things in life do get easier. I mean, I'm not
Mm.
saying that
Mm.
life is easy, because it's not, but
Yeah.
for the most part, I'd say, scale of 1 to 10, I'd say, 1 being the least comfortable, 10 being the most
Yeah.
comfortable. I'd say 6, and 6 may
Yeah.
sound quite low, but I think compared to where I was,
Yeah.
but the reason why I say 6 is, in those moments where in the very rare moments where I do have a flare up of the OCD,
Mm.
it's still very difficult for me to pull myself back and go, okay, your past experiences have taught you this, the evidence for this, all the rest
Mm.
of it. This part of you that's trying to protect all the rest of it. Sometimes that does still go out the window, and you almost
Mm.
you can feel in those moments that you're back to square one. But I
Yeah.
think other things that have helped is looking at it in a more holistic way.
Mhm.
I said you asked the question about religion and sexuality, and I wanted to make it clear that
Mm.
I didn't want to present my experience of OCD in a black and
Mhm.
white way, because it is very much a nature nurture thing. And I know that a lot of counsellors and therapists in the field um, are trained to avoid the pitfalls of the medical model, which I think is true. I think it is a mistake to oversimplify and assign someone or label someone as disordered in some way, because
Yeah.
as I hope that we both demonstrated, it's not quite as simple as being disordered. And actually, these patterns of behaviour are beneficial and are useful,
Mm.
but they're
Mm.
useful and beneficial for a specified period of time, and often they get stuck.
Yeah.
And that's just the nature of trauma. Our we are, I want to quote one of my, really brilliant singer called Grace Slick of Jefferson Airplane, who said that
Mhm.
we are ultra intelligent beings that have the nervous systems of rabbits, meaning that
Yeah.
through all the rationality that we can sort of impart on ourselves or other people, if
Mm.
there's trauma there, the wound is still with you, and it means that it can take
Mm.
a long time for your nervous systems catch up and realize that you're
Yeah.
safe.
Yeah.
Um, so I do agree and see why in terms of the way that therapy is going, we tend to be more avoidant of the medical model.
Mm.
But I think that dismissed highly, particularly when it comes to something like OCD, is a mistake.
Mhm.
When I was diagnosed, the last question that my psychiatrist asked me before she diagnosed me, and she diagnosed me very quickly after my answer,
Mm. Mm.
was, "Does OCD run in your family?"
Yeah.
Um, and I was able to provide 5 or 6 examples of, at least one definite case of OCD in my family, although
Yeah.
it was never diagnosed. One person where I go, yeah, that's OCD, and several other members of my family who definitely had obsessive compulsive traits to a detrimental degree.
Yeah.
And the thing is, OCD is argued in the medical field, and I do agree with this, that there is a massive genetic component to OCD. It's hereditary. Now, we can look at hereditary as being a combination of the genetics that we're born with, but also the things that we learn. And having that reassurance of a diagnosis and a label, for me personally, did feel in that moment when I was 17 like a massive weight was lifted. And now
because why was that?
Because as I said earlier, that there was always room for doubt for me. There was still this fundamental feeling underneath all of this that there was something essentially fucked up and evil about me, and that I was the exception to the rule, and that there was something fundamentally wrong with me as a person. Like, I as a person was broken, as opposed to this being
I have OCD.
And having a label also means that I had tools and clear tools in which I could manage it. I mean, I also think, and I know that a lot of therapists that I know, both personally and professionally, might disagree with this. I'm a big proponent of using medication if it's necessary. My, as I said, I'm on fluoxetine, and that deals with both the anxiety that comes with, OCD, but also helps level out the associated depression that comes with it. And I do accept that, my OCD, and I do genuinely believe that, and I'm not saying this is the case for everyone, but I believe that my OCD is something that I'm going to have to live with for the rest of my life, but I'm not quite so resentful about that anymore.
Yeah.
And as far as sex, go on.
No, please finish what you were saying.
And just a very quick add-on to answer the question about sexuality and religion. I still have beef with the Catholic Church, which, and I will leave it at that. As this, I could talk about that, my beef with the Catholic Church for hours. And as far as my sexuality, it's a work in progress. I think one of the things that's been very healing for me, and this is something that I think we as therapists don't like to admit, because we're there for the client is the center, and all the rest of it, and those things are true, but we are wounded healers, and inevitably we do heal our own shit through our clients without not intentionally, but we do it. And I've been very lucky in that from as soon as I started my placement as a counselling student, from hour one, and I'm now, over 1,000 hours in, to my career. I've had the opportunity to work with members of the LGBTQ+ community, specifically gay men, but also connecting with my trans and non-binary brothers and sisters, my lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, asexual brothers and sisters, and be able to connect with people that I genuinely admire. I think that in order for us to do the work that we do, we can't work with clients unless we feel some degree of love and admiration for them. And I think that in doing so, in connecting with people within my own community, and being able to contribute, I hope, by normalizing their experiences and empowering them, my relationship with my sexuality is better than it ever has been. It's still not, there's still things that I'm working through, but I certainly don't feel ashamed of my sexuality anymore.
Exactly what I was gonna say. It's collectively working through shame, or collectively working through collective shame, especially with I don't want to use, I'm not sure the word minority groups is the right word I'm used here, but groups that are traditionally discriminated against, We've got just under 10 minutes left, and we've maxed out our time, which I'm very happy with. The last question, and again, my fifth question was if there's a relationship between intersectionality and OCD, or intersectionality and shame, and what you've said, and kind of addressed that point and touches on it in other ways. Another part of my curiosity that you mentioned again was the genetic hereditary aspect, which again could be its own 2-hour episode and much more. But the final question that I want to ask is, what question do you wish people asked more when it comes to the subjects that we've covered? What is it that maybe doesn't get asked enough or doesn't get raised enough in conversations, or things that you've wanted to be able to answer, if there is anything? I'm sure you'll think about it immediately afterwards.
The question that I wish people would ask about OCD.
Yeah, OCD is the center. Yeah, my thought is often like, I often feel there's questions that we think about the answer to, but no one then ever asks the question. So I'm curious, what if there is anything? What question do you wish people asked?
I wish people would ask, how. I don't know if people, I wish people would ask honestly, not so much connected to the OCD specifically, but were to ask honestly. I suppose it's not so much the question. I'd be curious about how many people would answer honestly if they were asked, about their experience of intrusive thoughts.
Yeah.
Because the only distinction between OCD and between someone with OCD and someone who doesn't have OCD in relation to intrusive thoughts is that people with obsessive compulsive disorder attach meaning and attach morality to intrusive thoughts.
Yeah.
But the reality is everybody experiences them.
Yeah.
For example, people talk about staring into the void, where people are like at the top of a really tall building on a cliff or whatever.
Yeah.
And then they feel that that sick feeling that goes, up from their genitals all the way up through their body. It's this whole thing. And it's not a fear of heights and fear of the void doesn't come from fear of falling.
Yeah.
It comes from fear of what happens if I listen to that intrusive thought or sort of act on that intrusive thought of me jumping off that cliff or that building or whatever it may be, or they actually jump. Or, when people are, people, who commute, I know that's happening less and less now since COVID, but, being on a train platform and then imagining, pushing the person for no reason, imagining pushing that person into the oncoming train, or imagining themselves jumping in front of the oncoming train. I'd be curious to get that, for people to be more honest and open-minded about, because the reality is, because we are very intelligent, and I'd argue too intelligent for our own good, we have very active imaginations, and therefore, in ways that contradict this idea that we are hyper intelligent, hyper rational beings, our minds can take us some weird places. And I wish more of a space for people to talk about intrusive thoughts and to talk about the weird places that our brains can go, because that's what makes us human, that those weird little idiosyncrasies. And I suppose part of the reason why I wanted to do this is that I wish that I had heard I'd listened to someone, talk honestly and openly and candidly about their experiences and go, actually, there's nothing wrong with you fundamentally as a person. It's a quirk that you have, or it's a necessary protective response to trauma that's got stuck, or there's a genetic component or a societal component
to de-shame it, right? To remove the experience from the shame, so that you can learn to heal and learn to recover and learn to live.
I think for not just for people with OCD, but for the for everyone, in relation to intrusive thoughts, just to help people not take themselves so fucking seriously, because I have intrusive thoughts sometimes that make me laugh, that I look at and go, where the fuck did that come from? And you might ask me for an example, but none are coming to me.
No, that's okay.
Right now, but just the weird little places that our mind goes. When I'm in a good place, the place that my mind goes, in terms of my intrusive thoughts, they amuse me now rather than scare me.
Yeah. You look at the mind and say, how, rather than, oh my God. Yeah. What does that say about me, or what does that mean for the future? And it's a fundamentally different response that either leads into something you need to do about it, some way of protecting or preventing, or just kind of accepting it and moving on, refocusing on whatever it is that's going on in your life.
I mean, and I'm in that respect. I also think it's important for me to say that I'm in a very privileged position to be able to say that I am able to, that I do know myself, and that more than I did before, and that allows me to have a better relationship with my OCD or my parts generally. I know that there is nothing intrinsically shameful about being gay. I know that I'm not a paedophile, one, because I'm a big advocate for children and their well-being, and two, I'm not sexually attracted to children. I know that my thoughts and the evidence that I'm looking for doesn't necessarily, it isn't necessarily the truth. I know that I'm aware that these responses that I have are trauma responses, but the reality is I'm in a privileged position in that I can afford to access resources like therapy. I'm in a privileged position in that I have a good support network of friends and family around me. I'm fortunate and privileged in the sense that, even though I am part of a minority group as part of the LGBTQ plus community, I don't have added intersectional stresses of being a person of colour, for example, or being an immigrant or a refugee or having a disability. And I'm aware that there are multiple layers that can, serve to complicate, experiencing OCD, where, actually getting to the bottom of it and understanding it and getting comfortable with it, doesn't necessarily take priority. So I feel very lucky in that I've had both that I've had the resources, but also compassion from other people, both personally and professionally, that has allowed me to be in the position where I am now.
Yeah. Well, I'm also very grateful for you to come here and talk about your position and your journey through it all. I really appreciate the time that you've given to me and hopefully to us as listeners. And I can't wait to talk more about other subjects with you if you'd be interested to do other episodes in future. Because it's been a real privilege, Phil. So thank you so much. And we'll call it there then. Thank you. We'll see you next time. Good luck, and take care. And if you want to plug yourself, I don't know if there's a particular plug, but
well, okay. Well, I do have an Instagram page for my private practice, but I'm not very diligent about putting stuff on there. I've got like 2 posts. So probably not the best place to follow me. My counselling practice, my private practice, is called Black Sheep Counselling and Psychotherapy.
Black Sheep Counselling and Psychotherapy. Yeah.
If you want to follow my art account, which I do post more regularly on there, it's called The Black Sheep Cometh, at The Black Sheep Cometh.
Cool.
I liked the whole notion of the black sheep thing because I think it's sort of been an overarching thing. We all feel, I think it's part of a universal human experience, whether we have OCD or not, to feel like we are at least one point in our life, to feel that we don't belong or that we're outside of it. That doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, it gives you a lot of advantages to go back to your point from earlier. So yeah, cool. Well, thank you very much, Phil, and
thank you.
And good luck, and maybe see you in the future. All right.
Definitely. Thank you.
So now that I've expect that you've heard the interview with Phil, there's just some references that Phil and I thought would be useful perhaps to people who themselves are struggling with OCD and who perhaps wanted some advice maybe on media that would be useful to them or potentially healing to them. And so Phil has recommended loads of stuff, which is amazing. He starts with books. One is Mad Girl by Bryony Gordon, which is an autobiography from someone who's also experienced harm OCD, drug addiction and eating disorders. There's also My Mad Fat Teenage Diary by Ray Earl, which is another autobiography. It's also been turned into a TV show. And there's finally The Velvet Rage by Alan Downs. And this is it's a self-help book written by a gay clinical psychologist about minority stress, particularly about gay men. Then there's also an interview on YouTube hosted by Soft White Underbelly, which is a channel that do a lot of more kind of gritty interviews. And this one is called Obsessive Compulsive Clown Interview Steve. And it's about this guy called Steve who's very, very, I suppose, eloquent about his experience of OCD and how terrifically hard it was to live through. But also how he's living with it now, or how he's, trying to recover from it. Then there's a couple of TV shows. One is called Pure, which is about women who have OCD, about a woman who has OCD, and specifically about intrusive thoughts about sex. And finally, there's a show called Everything Now, which is an excellent comedy drama about a young teenage girl with anorexia. I suppose if you have any thoughts or comments, by all means get in touch, or if you yourself would be interested in being part of the podcast, then just email becomingcomfortable.podcast@gmail.com, and I'd be very glad to hear from you. Thanks again. Have a lovely day, and see you next time. Bye.